So ethers are sort of a cousin of alcohols, and ethers react with HX through substitution, and it's the same idea as the alcohol, where it could be SN1 or SN2, but in general, in this strongly acidic solution, if a carbocation that's relatively stable can form, then the SN1 is faster. So overall, if you have a tertiary, a benzylic, or an allylic ether, those will proceed through an SM1 mechanism. If instead it's not highly substituted, like a methyl or a primary, then it will go through SN2. And methyl, of course, is faster than primary because it's less hindered. And secondary gives a mess, just like with the alcohols.